We are honored to have tonight the Director of Management and Budget, Kevin Chatellier. He was appointed to that position in August 2020. He replaced Director David Bradley. And Chatellier started his career as management and budget analyst with the City of Virginia Beach in 2008, was promoted to a senior analyst in 2014. He was promoted to budget and management services administrator. 2017, named acting co-director of budget and management services in 2019. Kevin stood out in the process for several reasons, said Duhaney. Not only does he have the experience with our budget processes, issues, and systems, Kevin has demonstrated command of the range of skills necessary for this key leadership position. It requires a combination of analytic, technical, managerial, and interpersonal skills to guide the development of multi-billion-dollar operating and capital budgets for a city as diverse and complex as Virginia Beach.
I didn't know that.
Yes, and he was confident that he would excel in leading the department and helping us address financial and resource impacts of the pandemic. And he has a bachelor's degree in Masters of Public Management? Administration.
Yep.
Okay. And we do this every year. Kevin Chatellier.
Hello, everyone. Can everybody hear me? All right. I'll try to make a point to talk extra loud as I work through the presentation. So I was going to try to move through the presentation, if everybody's okay with it, pretty quickly. I know this is a group who's very in tune, and you probably already...
I just want to ask you a question. You want to go through the budget and everybody ask questions after you're done?
That would be my preference.
Yes,
That's
so
okay.
everybody please hold your questions until the end. Write them down on your paper so that you don't forget them.
And I really will try to move faster, so I'm not talking at everybody, because I think this group just likes to have more of a Q&A session. So with no further, I need to recognize Deputy Director of the City for Budget, Deputy Director of Budget for the City, Katie James, and her husband, back over there, Thomas. Thanks for coming out, Thomas. Husband. There we go. Okay. Annually, the city obviously goes through a budget process. It is pretty much a year-long budget process. We kicked this off in early August with the closing of the previous year's financials, and we started looking at revenue estimates and beginning the development of this. It's been something that we've worked on since August. The first forward-facing document we came out with was the 5-year forecast, which came out in the month of November, and we presented it to City Council and the school board. And so it's really a year-long public engagement process that we use to develop the operating budget. So right now, the point of the stage that we're at is where the city manager's proposed budget has been presented. City Council has that. We're engaging with the public, presenting the budget, talking with the public about the budget. We're going to be having 2 upcoming budget hearings, or public hearings on the operating budget, where the public's free to come out and give their thoughts and opinions to City Council on what's been proposed and where we got it wrong and what they would like to see to make it right. So with no further ado, what I'm going to be presenting is what's been included in the city manager's proposed budget, but is certainly subject to be amended by City Council. So quick high-level overview, some of the things that are key takeaways in looking at overall budget growth year to year. The budget's growing about 2.77%. Obviously that's being driven by the revenues that are projected in terms of the overall growth in the budget. And so 2.77% is less than the rate of inflation, which is about around 3.5% as of January, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics.
I think you have to do this with the mic.
This?
Yes.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, I'll make note of that. All right. So one of the other things that's typically a talking point with the operating budget are FTEs and the change of FTEs within the operating budget. So you can see here on this slide, total city school combined FTEs are proposed to change, be reduced by 17.15 FTEs. So this is spoken of in terms of net, and I'll get into what that means here in just a second. So if you look down below that, you can see that the city has a net increase of 19.25. So there's a slide, and as I'm working through the budget proposals and the ads, you'll also see a follow-up slide where I'll walk through some of the reductions. So even though there's an add of 19.25, there was actually an overall reduction within other departments that was greater than that, because we simply taken the 19.25 you see here, part of the proposed budget. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, so that's causing me to trip up, but there's 17 firefighters that are being included in the proposed budget, and about 16 public works FTEs that are being included that are supported through VDOT revenue. So just between those two alone, it's close to 30 FTEs that are being added, but you can see here that I'm only reflecting a 19 FTE add, as others were reduced within the city, and again, I'll cover that in just a second. Schools, their superintendent estimate of needs whenever it came out had a net reduction of 36.4 FTEs. So between city and schools combined, that's how we got to the negative 17 FTEs being proposed. In terms of overall operating budget expenditures are anticipated to be able to maintain all current level of services being provided in the current year, continuation of those next year, while also being mindful of the direction by City Council to reduce the real estate tax rate. From the currently adopted rate of 99 cents, they requested the city manager develop a proposed budget based on a 2-cent rate reduction from that. So the proposed budget includes a 97-cent tax rate. Some other notables is the city treasurer had put a request in or presented to City Council the concept of making a reduction or a extended grace period on the due date for real estate and personal property. Previously, city code didn't allow a large grace period, so if you were 1 day overdue from making that payment, you got hit with the full weight of the penalties and interest associated with that. So the proposed budget includes a 5-day grace period to where it's due say first, but if the check or the payments received all the way up to the 6th, then no penalties or interest will be accumulated or accrued in terms of that bill. Some other notables is the importance of real estate revenue growth and the overall long-term sustainability of the city. Real estate's the largest revenue source that the city has, and it's long been one the city most relied on to maintain and sustain operations. So for context, it's about 50% of the city's general fund overall revenue. So whenever this slide here notes that real estate revenue growth is about 4.6%, the overall revenues is not growing near that amount. You can see up at the top of this, total budget's growing about 2.77%. So what we're seeing with the other revenue sources is collectively, it's pretty much a wash. They're about break even. So we've got some adjustments for some going up and then others going down, but primarily the budget's dependent on growth in the real estate to maintain services. And then there's a few other fee adjustments that I'll get to whenever I work through the slides. So these next few slides, this group certainly saw this last year. Is this a repeat? It's just making note of some of the past actions City Council has made in an effort to try to provide tax relief to the Virginia Beach residents. Starting with the top, elderly and disabled. So this is reflected on here. This is an optional program that the City Council has had in place for a long time. We're certainly the most how do I word it? Our offering of this, or the city's offering of this to those that qualify, are one of the most robust programs within the region when comparing to the Southampton Roads area. So there's actually a comparison of that in the executive summary, as is required to make a review every 3 years. One that isn't mandated but listed here for context is the Veterans Tax Relief. So the number for that, estimated real estate tax relief for that in FY25 is about $27.5 million. So worth noting about this one is that that's the FY25 number. If anybody recalled this slide from last year, that number was about $21 million. So we're seeing 24% growth in this a year. That's not being driven by the assessment growth, that's being driven by enrollment within the program. So another way of trying to back math that is thinking of that, if that's really $6 million in tax relief growing each year, that's about $60 million worth of assessed property values that are coming off the city's tax rolls. So it's growing at a really fast rate, something we're certainly mindful of, and we're not the only locality seeing this. This is something localities are talking about across the Commonwealth in terms of what the impact this mandate's having on them. So some of the other ones, personal property, B-poll, tax relief initiatives over the years. I made note previously that the proposed budget has a 2-cent real estate tax rate reduction. So a couple of years ago, City Council reduced the rate by 2.75%. You can see that struck through there. Taking into account this 2-cent reduction, if City Council approves it, there'll be a combined 4.75-cent tax rate, and that's the equivalent whenever you take into account the per penny amount of about $37.4 million in tax avoidance. Moving through, these are related to the pandemic initiatives that were made available through the redirection of ARPA and CARES Act funding. So collectively, between all the slides, as well as what City Council redirected to nonprofit organizations such as United Way to provide emergency relief to households in need and nonprofit organizations, collectively between all these previous slides, it's about $219 million of tax relief provided.
Can you tilt that microphone up just a hair?
Is that better?
Yeah.
I feel like I'm trying to be too cool doing this or something. Is that
American
Idol? Yeah, I know, right? That's what I feel.
The antenna needs to get out. The antenna goes on the bottom, so it needs to get out to the back.
Okay.
At the back of the room.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So getting back to what I was talking about earlier, based on the guidance input from City Council at their February retreat, the proposed budget is able to accommodate and do what they had requested, which is provide a budget that maintains current services the best ability that the city can, look to invest in the Focus Action Plan, a City Council adopted initiative program, or plan that they approved at the previous retreat, where possible. Utilize public feedback from the resident satisfaction survey, which we certainly use as a guiding tool in our decision-making process throughout the budget. Reduce the real estate tax rate by 2 cents, minimize new spending, redistribute resources, identify one-time costs, eliminate vacancies if necessary before looking to eliminate filled positions, and then share reductions with existing policies and dedications. And that's really something I'm going to jump into in a little bit more detail, as that was a big change in the direction provided by City Council coming out of the retreat. Here's another visual of the proposed budget, looking at it in terms of a pie chart. So you can see the $2.6 billion operating budget that's being proposed, with the largest portion of the pie being there in the yellow, which is the schools. The second and third largest slivers of the pie are public safety and the planning, public works, public utilities, or the infrastructure sections of the city. I made note of this last year, and it's really the same. The budget that was developed and being presented for the public's considerations, not like the budgets that was developed 2 or 3 years ago coming out of the pandemic. So what do I mean by that? So going into the pandemic, and this is just background, not in the slides, going into the pandemic, there was a lot of uncertainty. And one of the things that the city did in developing that next year's proposed budget is we reduced $67 million out of the base. That came through reduction of revenues, FTEs, and expenditures that were originally proposed or being proposed. So as the pandemic moved on and we began to bounce back, we grew and bounced back quicker than was originally anticipated. So what occurred is our revenues were here, and then to our surprise, the following year, the revenues came in here and they performed much higher. So there's a few reasons for that. One, just the city opened up and opened up its beaches and got approval to do that, put a lot of precautions in place, and the city just was very resilient in that regard. But another thing that helped bolster that was the perfect timing of the Supreme Court ruling in which sales tax had to be remitted for online sales that occurred within localities. Supreme Court ruled that the locality was entitled to receive its portion of the sales tax that in which a sale occurred. So the timing of that happened right at the beginning of the pandemic, right about the time everybody was no longer shopping at bricks and mortar because they couldn't, but they were doing their online sales, online purchases at home. So the city was certainly able to benefit from that and the timing of that decision. But again, the proposed budget looked to do what City Council requested and make a reduction in the real estate tax rate. So for context, you can see up there, we're experiencing lower general fund overall growth of about $35 million. And whenever you take into account the revenue sharing formula split with schools, with the city retaining $21 million and the schools receiving $14 million of that through the revenue sharing formula, then that'll make, purpose of having those numbers here is for the upcoming slides, because I'm going to take that $21 million and kind of work off of it in building the operating budget. So kind of like TurboTax, I guess. Up on the top right, you'll see that balance being carried over from the previous slide. I'd mentioned earlier that we began this back in November with the 5-year forecast. And one of the things that was communicated to City Council in the presentation back then is there are just operating budget drivers, kind of the must-dos, if you will, or the things that you have to do to keep the operations going or are mandated. A good example is the VRS, the Virginia Retirement System. So it's the city's pension system that the city's a part of the overall state pension system. The rate is actually established by the state based on actuarial needs of that. So it was a reset year and a look at the rate, and the rate adjustment went up. So that resulted in the need to increase the VRS contribution by about $6 million. Debt service, again, it's the equivalent of a homeowner's mortgage payment. It's something you got to pay. It's a debt obligation. If the city wants to maintain its AAA bond rating, it's an obligation we have to pay, and the debt service is projected to go up by $3.6 million. Risk management, that's like the city's equivalent of its insurance policy, worker comp payments. That's projected to go up $2.3 million. Elderly and disabled tax relief, year-to-year growth in the local option or the locally administered program is about $2 million. City garage charges. The city garage is finally getting hit, and they're playing catch up. The rate of inflation and the cost of goods and materials to keep the vehicles, police cruisers, fire trucks, public utility vehicles on the road. Sheriff Office body-worn camera program. So it's a newly implemented initiative within the Sheriff's Office where the police body-worn cameras have been expanded to the Sheriff's Office. The year-over-year, the annual need to annualize cost for that's about $2.3 million. Some other smaller amounts of police technology licenses, such as the shot spotter technology the police department implemented. There's a licensing cost associated with that. Those technology investments result in the need of about $900,000. And then line of duty pay is a mandated program by the state in which the locality has to contribute to that, and that went up by $300,000. So just taking these initiatives or these budget drivers into account, that $21 million balance is now reduced down to $2.1 million. As we were working through the operating budget process, there were some other needs that were identified that we weren't anticipating going in. Those that were watching the budget hearing briefings likely heard the fire department communicate the need for additional firefighters within their operations. So this is something that first was presented to the city manager as part of the operating budget, where they submitted a need for 60 firefighters. We didn't have the ability or the means to be able to fully fund that. However, the city manager's proposed budget does include an additional 17 firefighters at an operating cost of 1.7. So it's about a third of what the overall request was for the fire department to maintain services. This was not to expand services for 4-person staffing, but to maintain it. Some other initiatives included EMS staffing last year, and city council and public was made aware of the challenges that EMS or the volunteer rescue squads are having to complete the service, providing EMS services with the city through the volunteer utilization that they've historically used. So I tell my dad this all the time, and it just does not compute. He can't understand how a city of our size can operate and rely entirely or primarily on an entirely voluntary EMS service to respond to all of our emergency needs. And it's really amazing. The city's looking to continue that partnership, even though additional career paramedics have been added to the Department of EMS. They've requested 4 additional FTEs, and those have been included in the proposed operating budget. So what they had success with in the current year was a redirection of some of the previously authorized full-time FTEs to part-time status. And so they're able to turn 4 full-time positions into 12 part-time positions in the current year, and they're finding success with that. So they requested to continue that, but also receive the 4 FTEs, authorization for the 4 FTEs next year to get back up to the full-time authorization that was previously approved. I mentioned the importance of the volunteer rescue squads. So the proposed budget also includes a continuation of the $800,000 grant that was provided to the squads in the current year. So the rescue squads, they're basically an extension of our EMS department. And as such, they're seeing significant challenges not only with their level of volunteerism, but also with the cost of goods and materials and their payments for their ambulances, which they're responsible for fundraising and purchasing themselves. They do it through a partnership with the city where we'll provide a 0 and interest-free loan for them, and then they make annual payments, but it's getting harder and harder for them to make those annual payments. So the proposed budget does again continue a grant amount of $800,000 to the Rescue Council to spread out amongst all the various squads. ECCS, they're looking to invest in some technology services that'll hopefully help them address their call answering times. They've been plagued by vacancies and long-term vacancies for quite some time now. So one of the interesting things that we're looking to explore is the potential utilization of AI functionality for the non-emergency calls to see, because they provide the 311 function or just the informational service function within the city. So they're looking to see if AI can be utilized there and how well the public receives that and if it's actually usable. And other localities are doing this. I'm not familiar with any that have applied that to emergency services yet, but I don't think ECCS is looking to do that just quite yet. Increase in the sheriff medical and food contract, and then security contracting increases throughout the city. This is something that a lot of departments had an additional need for. The city uses a contractual service to provide security at City Hall, the Convention Center, Human Services, and other departments. And there was a need to increase departments' operating budgets for cost increases in that contract. In addition to that, there's some enhanced hours. So unfortunately, within the Department of Human Services, they're being left as the middleman or the messenger. A lot of the federal programs and benefit offerings of the federal agencies are being eliminated or terminated and coming to an end. And unfortunately, Human Services is the bearer of that bad news. And so they've expressed a need for some additional security presence at their facilities to cut down on altercations. Taking those into account, here that $2.1 million positive balance we had now becomes a negative $3 million balance. Some other operating initiatives that were identified, voter registrar. Next year is a presidential election year, and there's a need to up staff and provide them the resources to provide all the polling precincts, the staffing, the mailings, and be prepared for that. That comes at an estimated cost of $1.2 million. Continuation of the housing owner occupied rehab program. This was a pilot program put in place 2 years ago by the Department of Housing and Neighborhood Preservation. So this is for houses that fall in between the qualifying parameters of federal assistance through some of the programs. They fall just in between the gap of being eligible for those. And so, but it is a real need, and they're seeing a lot of success with this in some of those neighborhoods that don't qualify simply because they live in the BRAC zones.
In the what zone?
In the BRAC or the AQ, yeah, the right around the military base. Sorry.
Sorry.
There, okay, hold it up higher again. All right. Looking in terms of compensation, the proposed budget does include a 3.5% proposed compensation increase for city workforce. This is continuing the step plan initiative put in place by City Council 2 years ago. So what this will do for individuals who are on step plan is it'll move them up one step, which is the equivalent of approximately 3%, and then provide them a 0.5% general increase on top of that, and that's where the 3.5 comes into play for them. For those that are not on the step plan, the proposed budget will provide the non-step plan employees a 3% merit increase and a 0.5% general increase for a combined 3.5% compensation adjustment. And then also worth noting is that the employer health insurance premiums, or the contribution from the city to its health insurance plan for its employees, will increase $1.5 million while holding the employees' premiums flat. Taking into account this slide, that negative $3 million balance now becomes negative $25 million. I know, it's working in the wrong direction. And I promise you, building a budget's not as easy as this is making it look. But, so bringing that forward, that negative 25.5, these are some of the belt tightening initiatives, if you will, or some of the reductions that we're taking into account to work that number down. So I mentioned the firefighters, fire department got 17 FTEs, and that ECCS, or Emergency Communication Services, is struggling to fill all of its vacancies. The proposed budget recognizes that and acknowledges that, and is eliminating 17 of those positions for savings of $1.3 million. Also struggling with some being able to fill some positions is the Department of Human Services, and they have not been able to fill the nurses and the FTEs, or the positions, with one of the intermediate care facilities. And so that lease is coming to an end, and so the proposed budget is acknowledging that those positions have not been filled and proposing to eliminate 10.5 FTEs within Human Services and terminate the lease agreement on that, or not renew the lease agreement on that. So this is certainly a critical need. However, it's a pretty smooth transition according to Human Services, as they weren't able to staff the facility anyways due to vacancies. The individuals who were looking to receive care have been placed and provided alternative services at the other intermediate care facilities throughout the city. That resulted in a reduction of $1.15 million. Eliminating Economic Development's biomedical initiative line item of $1 million. Reducing the overall fuel budget by close to $1 million. Reduction of various operating supplies accounts within Human Services, City Treasurer, Courts, and Finance, for example. About $600,000 is mentioned here. These are the notable ones. However, I can tell you that a lot of departments did a lot of belt tightening within their operating budgets themselves. Unlike some other government agencies that whenever they start the next year, it's automatically predicated on an inflationary increase, or it's growing like the federal budget, from one year to the next. Starting point, it's already assuming a baseline growth to keep up with inflation. We don't do that as part of our budget process. We ask departments on the front end to try to make do with their existing resources to absorb those increases and manage the funds. So I certainly know there's a lot of belt tightening along the way for them to be able to do that whenever CPI is driving some of these annual contracts up, 4 or 5%. Budget, we're looking to switch budget software tools, resulting in a reduction of $500,000 a year. Eliminating 5 FTEs within libraries, where they're looking to consolidate some services and centralize some functions, and they're looking to receive some efficiencies through that, allowing them to eliminate 5 FTEs. Within the housing department, elimination of a maintenance worker for the Housing Resource Center that was established upon its opening. Within the planning department, a planning right-of-way agent or coordinator that's been a long-term vacancy within the department. And then a little bit of a haircut to some of the regional grants. So taking those reductions into account, that negative 25 million balance comes down to 20. So then there was a need to look for some of more of the one-time initiatives. So we looked at what were some of the one-time costs we could use general fund balance for. Presidential elections, a one-time cost. The Rescue Council grant that I previously mentioned, the $800,000, and then fire department equipment. So the importance of using fund balance for these one-time costs and not necessarily for establishing FTEs in an ongoing perpetual nature. It's not sustainable. The GFOA, it's best practice to use fund balance for those one-time initiatives. So that 2.5 million reflected up there works it down a little bit more. The budget does include the use of attrition savings. A specific line item of $10 million is used to balance the general fund operating budget, but it's also worth noting the budget relies on more than just this $10 million being referenced. So for example, each year the police department has, on average, probably 100 vacancies over the course of the year where churn happens. So because of that, they have an increased need in their overtime. Well, we don't fully fund their overtime to the dollar for dollar amount need, so they overexpend that each year. So they use some of their attrition savings to cover that additional overtime cost that they have throughout the year. So we allow that flexibility, and departments have that utilization. So we certainly use more attrition annually than just the $10 million noted here. So that gets us down to 7.5 million in the hole. So this is where it gets a little bit complicated. So this resulted in the need to make reductions to the CIP in the form of PAYGO. So what PAYGO is we have the revenue estimated in the current year. How much of that revenue do we take cash, true cash on hand, and put towards the CIP? So that's pay-as-you-go financing. So what we looked for in the CIP were projects that could go away or that no longer had a need. So a couple of examples, the MOCA building, with MOCA relocating from its current location, which is a city-owned building. There was a program CIP that had $1 million in next year's CIP, and it was specifically for items and needs within the facility for MOCA accreditation purposes. So we were able to redirect that or eliminate that need. But even after doing those, there was still a need to touch some of the city council dedications or prior city council dedications. This was the direction that they provided at the retreat, and acknowledging that it was going to be a difficult year and the general fund might not be able to take the entire reduction of the real estate tax rate, so they were willing to explore this as a consideration. So after a vetted process, we were able to identify these listed here in terms of having some level of capacity to redirect to offset the general fund reduction. So these listed here, the Agricultural Reserve Program, ARP, 500,000, Open Space, 500,000, Tourism Advertisement Program, 500,000, Tourism Investment Program, 800,000, and some of the Economic Development Investment Program, or the EDIP project. So collectively, this $2.5 million, an increase occurred from each of these dedications to the CIP, allowing the general fund to reduce its contribution to the CIP. So it was a wash, but allowing the general fund to make that reduction in the real estate tax rate. So with that, you can see that negative 7.5 million balanced out to zero. So this is just a little bit more into the process that was used to vet these in terms of how we identified the ones that had capacity, what would break if anything was redirected from those dedications. And where best possible, we attempted to try to connect or tie the redirect to existing projects that were aligned with that existing dedication. So for example, within the TIP, or the Tourism Investment Program, it's a resort-focused or tourism-focused dedication. Well, there's two existing CIP projects, the Oceanfront Capital Reinvestment Project and the Virginia Beach Amphitheater Maintenance Project. The amphitheater project, or the amphitheater is one of the city's largest generators of the amusement tax revenue, which is dedicated to the tourism investment program. And then the Oceanfront Capital Project Reinvestment is a $600,000 CIP project that's historically been funded by the general fund. So combined, those are $800,000 that was a redirect, and the dedication is now supporting those projects, and the general fund is no longer supporting those projects. So that's just an example, or trying to explain as to how that might work. I mentioned some of the other departments with increases, such as Public Works, where they received, I think, 16 FTEs, and that was made available through an increase in VDOT revenue. So that's just noting it here. Those FTE adds didn't come at the detriment of the general fund or local tax dollars. Those were provided through support from the state and VDOT revenues for the purpose of which they're being provided. So for maintenance of roads, construction inspectors, and positions that align with that initiative. One thing worth noting here also, in terms of the fees, is that the proposed budget does include a $3.05 proposed increase in the monthly waste collection fee. So the purpose of this is for the specific purpose of recycling services. Those in here might be familiar that Chesapeake eliminated this service a couple of years ago. It's been communicated by the Public Works Director for the last couple of years that the city's recycling contract is coming to an end. The current contractor has already requested that the city renegotiate with them because they are experiencing exorbitant cost increases. So whenever the city was looking to put this back out and go to the market on this, it did in fact confirm that the contract is likely going to increase and more than double in the upcoming year for continued curbside recycling services. So the proposed budget includes the amount necessary to cover this contract increase, which is $3 a month for curbside recycling services. It's being proposed. City Council is aware of it, but it's really a policy decision that City Council will have an opportunity to hear from the public on in terms of the importance of recycling services and if they wish to continue this or not. Because if the fee goes away, the alternative decision could just be that the city doesn't do curbside recycling services. So just worth noting is that within the executive summary, the operating budget, is a list of requested but not funded needs that were submitted by departments that the proposed budget was not able to get to. I think it's about, well, there it is right there. It totals $32.7 million and 242 FTEs. Keeping in mind, that's a combination of current service requests as well as enhanced service requests. So within that 242 FTEs, I believe is another 80 FTEs that the fire department requested for expanded services related to 4-person staffing initiatives. This slide here is just trying to talk about the timing, and this group's very in tune, so you're probably very familiar with the overall timing of the process. I mentioned earlier that it starts for us back in August and November with the 5-year forecast, but what I wanted to get at here is Governor's proposed budget comes out in December. We have the budget deliberations in the month of January, but the schools are really developing their superintendent estimate of needs in this time right after they receive the governor's budget. So they're taking into account the governor's proposed budget and the impacts it'll have on them, as well as the impact of the local revenue sharing formula. So they developed superintendent estimate of needs. And that's really what we have and all we have to work on whenever we're developing the city manager's proposed budget, and that's what's been included for consideration. However, as we're in the midst of going to print with that information, the school board typically adopts their proposed budget, which is taken up by City Council as a part of reconciliation. So I talk about all this nuance to explain that The governor's proposed budget was very lean in terms of its contribution to schools. I think it was about $600,000 increase in state revenue for the schools. The House and the Senate both have budget proposals out there that range between $9 and $20 million $9 and $30 million as an increase for Virginia Beach public schools. So there's a good chance that schools will be bringing something forward for City Council to consider to increase their state revenue from what it was originally adopted, or as it was originally adopted by. And this is just more into the numbers in terms of what was included in the superintendent estimate of needs. Something worth noting is the compensation adjustment for schools as currently proposed is about 3.5%, which is in line with the city, although theirs is a little bit more nuanced in that they received a 2% increase January that City Council authorized and approved, and that was provided by the state. So what they're really doing is annualizing that cost into next year and then looking to provide a step increase resulting in a 1.5% additional adjustment. So that's how they get to the 3.5. But also keep in mind the conversations going on at the state is that a lot of the money that's to be going to schools is supposedly to be earmarked for additional compensation adjustments. So that number could increase. I'm going to move through the CIP a little bit quicker so that way I can get to the group's questions because I'm sure you all are chomping at the bit and I'm boring you all to death. Something that's always a hot button item and a priority to the public are roadways. So something that happened in the current year is due to lack of availability of funding, there was a need to delay or push out several roadway projects and CIP projects. So good news is it was communicated to City Council and the public at that time that Public Works will be looking to pursue state and federal grants to try to get those projects back fully funded in the CIP. They're in the out years of the CIP. So what we experienced was a need to accelerate the local funding program on those to meet inflationary pressures on projects going to construction in the more near term. And so they're sitting there with a balance to complete in the out years of the CIP. So 3 roadway projects worth noting. Cleveland Street's now reflected as fully funded within the 6-year CIP. Shore Drive 4 and Elbow Road both received an increase of state and federal over the 6-year CIP with some local funding being put on those projects in the out year. Unfortunately, you can see here that acronym, please. So for Shore Drive 4, it says at the very end BTC 48.4, that's balance to complete, meaning that even with the increase of state and federal dollars and local funding, there's still a $48 million need that we haven't identified funds yet for on that project. So roadways is really one of the more difficult sections to balance because VDOT has changed their policy and if everything's competitive now. So if you apply and you receive VDOT funding for a project, you have to continue to maintain your local contribution share on that project. So even though it looks like a lot of funds might be sitting on a project and are available, there's a requirement to get and obtain the state and federal dollars on that, uphold that VDOT agreement or the grant to receive the funding. You have to keep the local funds on there. So within the CIP, and I'll touch on stormwater because this is again high priority. So there's the flood protection program, which everybody in here I'm sure is familiar with. That was primarily funded through the bond referendum a few years ago, passed by 72% of the public. So there's inflation's having an impact on that as well. So what was originally thought to be a $567 million 21 project need, that's now ballooned up to where it's potentially over $1 billion. So even though it's just outside the 6-year CIP, that we'll need to start addressing or thinking about this. So one of the things that we're doing as city staff and with the Public Works and the Citizen Task Force or the Citizen Committee, Oversight Committee, is that we're monitoring and we're really waiting to see what happens whenever we go issue the first set of bonds. Because something the City Council was very smart doing upon authorizing the bonds is they put a system in place to where anything that is retired or debt that's retired from that goes back into the calculus and is to only be used for additional flood protection program initiatives or phase 2 projects. So it's long-term and ongoing bill payer down the road for the flood protection program. So we're really looking to see what the impact of that is, how much more state and federal grants Public Works can continue to secure, and honestly, just what type of capacity the market has in terms of contractors and what they can actually accomplish within the time frame. I'm sure this group's in tune with Rudy Lou, so I'll go ahead and just knock that one out of the park, I'm sure. So the proposed CIP includes $60 million for the Rudy Lou Park. So City Council authorized a $4 million transfer in the current, or appropriation in the current year, in the establishment of a Rudy Lou CIP project. As a part of that plan, there was also direction for staff to, they wanted to appropriate the $4 million now to begin the design, appropriate, I think, $5 million more, $6 million more in year 1 of the CIP, and then the residual in year 2 of the CIP. So the proposed budget has done that, and worth noting here is acronym, please. You'll see that says TIP. So the bill payer for this is out of the Tourism Investment Program dedication. So previously there was a $60 million parking garage project reflected in year 5, I believe, of the CIP. So what the proposed budget has done is redirected that $60 million of bond capacity from the TIP and put it towards the earlier years of the CIP to fully fund this project. So I'll try to move through. Just one thing quickly on this. I know I've seen Diana at City Hall, making comment to City Council and several other people in the room before. I don't know if you recall back in the winter months, whenever you probably had to wade through steaming water that was coming up out front of the building. So interesting is that the city municipal complex has an underground heating pipe that acts as the main heating source, heating element for the city facilities, as well as the hot water within the municipal building. So truly, the hot water, it's heated from a source within the municipal complex, and it's an underground pipe that runs to all the buildings and up through the walls, and then hot air, or air comes off of that over those hot pipes to heat the buildings. So that water line is failing, and so whatever I was walking through was a busted water main. And so even though they patched it and they fixed the hot water pipe, it was only 2 weeks later before the next weakest link went further down the line. Public Works has determined this as a very high need and priority, and so the estimated cost on that replacement is $29 million. And so that is included within the proposed budget. But again, where we're at, and if anybody's named Peter, if anybody's named Paul, I apologize, but where we're at in programming the CIP is really taken from Peter to give to Paul. So bill payer for this was the delay in the punting of the beach maintenance facility, which is a long overdue replacement facility of beach ops down at the ocean front. It's long been one of the worst facilities within the city. So just like the operating budget, the CIP has, or Capital Improvement Program, has a requested but not funded need as well, and that totals $634 million. That's not inclusive of the flood protection program, so that would be another $300-something million that would need to go on top of that, so about $1 billion. Quickly, the revenues, I touched on most of these in terms of the real estate. So this is something that I'm sure I'll pull back up because a group will want to talk about this. So this is just reflecting the year-to-year change for single-family median real estate assessment. So for a home at the median assessed value of $388,000, in the current year the annual tax bill will be about $3,600. In FY24, that tax bill will be $3,766. So that's a monthly change of $12, an annual change of $144. And you go, well, why do monthly? A lot of the public, myself, and most people escrow. So when it comes back, it looks in the form of an increase in your monthly bill. and this group would be proud of me. I've been conditioned well. We refer to this as a real estate tax avoidance, right? Because that's what it is. It's a tax avoidance. It's not saying by reducing the real estate tax rate by 2 cents, your tax bill year to year is reducing. It's an avoidance. So what that translates to is that 2 cent reduction, about saving tax avoidance of $78 a year, about $6.50 a month. This is just a reflection of Virginia Beach's tax rates. Here in the dark blue, the bottom line, with the other Hampton Roads localities. You can see that Portsmouth's hanging strong up there with 130. And Virginia Beach is here. You can see their $1 axis, and it's down to the 99 cents because it was through the FY24, because at that time, we didn't necessarily have what all the other Hampton Roads localities were looking to do with their proposed tax rates. And then this is just another slide that compares Virginia Beach's tax rates with the Hampton Roads localities. You see in real estate, it's just a reflection of the previous slide. We did compare the proposed rate of 97 cents though with their previously adopted rates. Personal property, business, machinery, tools, boats. For example, Virginia Beach has, for private boats, millionth of a cent is the tax rate. Virginia Beach is the lowest in most every category with the exception of solid waste and I think and the automobile price.